Hey everybody, Brain here. Welcome back to a new video. Today we are going to be going over game number 3 in our 9th tournament. And I am currently 1 out of 2, and I am now playing Greta. And I am, well, excited for the game. And this is going to be an interesting one because of something that happens later on, but we'll get to it. Okay, e4. Now we see c5, knight to f3, and d6. We see bishop to b5 check, knight to d7. So normally I played bishop to d7, and I was happy with the trade. And being okay with just trading here, either queen takes or knight takes, I think it's just preference at that point. But trading here can be beneficial to black in the sense that you're playing the Sicilian. Sometimes you can actually get a little bit less space, so trading off pieces helps. As well, if you have less space, you also likely don't have too many weaknesses as well, because you haven't pushed too many pawns and created your own weaknesses. However, if you are trying to play for complications, knight to d7 is the way for you. The reason why I say that is because, well, knight to c6, then at some point they do plan on taking, and this does damage your structure, and well, there is play that can be played against this, and sometimes it can be difficult to prove an advantage for black, as although black has the bishop pair, they also have a weakness, so it is a trade-off and is a dynamic position. But knight to d7 says, okay, if you want to give me the bishop pair, great. However, I am not going to play knight c6 and give you the opportunity to give me a weakness on c6. Instead, if you don't do anything, I'll play a6 and b5, kick your bishop away, and I will have gained space, and objectively, this move will have wasted time. So that was my goal here. Now we see c3, which is actually quite common with these bishop e5 moves, trying to go for a d4, an eventual d4. I went a6, now kicking the bishop away. We see bishop to a4 and b5. The idea is you can play bishop c2. You don't have to worry about bishop to b3. As if bishop b3, if c3 wasn't played, then b5 and c5, c4 would have trapped the bishop. For example, if we just go back here, before c3. If h3, for example, then a6, and they can't go on this diagonal anymore as c4 traps the bishop. So I thought I'd just make that clear for you guys. Alright, so c3, bishop a4, b5, and bishop to c2. Now I played bishop to b7, so that is one pro. I got a lot of queenside space, and this is the side of the board I would like to play on. Here we see castles and knight g8 to f6. It's very important for me to develop my kingside as fast as possible, as well I'm behind in development for the kingside. And luckily, this position isn't going to open immediately or anything. Say in e5, it just doesn't make sense, as not only is knight takes possible, or after knight takes, pawn takes, queen d6 or queen c7 will defend the pawn. And even if they get it back, I will have so much development for it that it wouldn't really matter anyways. Queen e2, queen c7, for example, rook e1, e6, and after takes, bishop to d6, I get all my development in, and black is likely even possibly slightly better in this position because, well, all of my pieces are developed and they're now behind in development. But okay, this is obviously not what would happen. e5 just doesn't make sense, even though strategically, like, it's understandable because, well, e5 opens the position or tries to open the position, but after that line you can see clearly it would not work out for white. After rook e1, trying to go for an e5, I go e6. And yeah, now that e5 also wouldn't make sense because after e5, for example, takes, knight takes, bishop takes, and bishop to d6, and a castle. So again, e5 doesn't make sense. But rook e1 is also not just preparing e5, it's just a good move in these positions because, well, you want to open the position, and, well, the rook on e1 is usually better than the rook on f1. So it is a good move. e6, d4, and I played bishop to e7. And I'm keeping the tension because you want white to take here, as if black takes, you are trading your c5 pawn for the c3 pawn. This is important to think about. C takes. As we can see here, The things that are gone in this position are the c pawns. And this is how you can evaluate trades in your position. And if we go back after bishop to e7, if they were to trade on c5, they're actually trading their d4 pawn for our d6 pawn. Now, there might be reasons to take on d4 in the future, and those should be accounted for correctly. But for now, it makes sense just to develop, play bishop e7. And this is what I did. Now we see bishop to f4. And finally, I decided to take, as I wanted to play rook to c8 and try to get some counterplay or some play on the c file. Objectively, I don't think c takes is actually a amazing move here. I would have rather have seen rook to c8 or just castles instead. But what is done is done, so you can't really do too much about that. So I took, and I played queen to c7, trying to get some play on this file. A move like knight to c3 almost makes sense as well. There is some possible b4 things in the future, but right now it's not really too much of a concern. Sorry, my cat is like scratching my bed. Okay. Yeah, so this isn't so great for black. It just, you can see that the bishop is somewhat staring at the queen. And well, the c file will eventually be controlled by a rook, as rook to c1 is only like 2 moves away, 1, 2, and then obviously the minor pieces will have to move, but they will have indirect control over the c file because of it. But alright, a3, not really a move I was expecting in the position, but it's not really hurting them in any way. Now I played e5, and e5 might not be so great for the fact that they could just play bishop g3, and they can just sit here. As I don't really want to take, they can just leave the pressure a little bit, and this can be uncomfortable for black, as again, if I ever take, not only knight takes, but queen takes is possible, and d6 is quite weak, as it's an isolated pawn, and d5 is very difficult to play. But my opponent decides to take on e5 instead, which I feel like relieves some of my pressure, which is nice. As now, well, there is no worrying about having to take on d4. We just traded the d6 pawn for the d4 pawn, which in these positions is what you want to do. So this was a successful trade on my part here. Now we see bishop to g3. And I played knight to h5. I really want the bishop pair. This is definitely something I had tunnel vision for when I was playing chess, or when I used to play tournaments, or when I played these tournaments. It's just nice to be able to get the bishop pair and say, hey, it's an open position, I have the bishop pair. Nice. Because you always hear that they are advantageous. Though this move also has its drawbacks. You're making 2 moves to make 1 trade, so you're kind of wasting time. However, it's reasonable, again, because you do get the bishop pair. Objectively, it might not make sense to, only because, well, this bishop's just looking at the pawn. It's not really doing too much in this position. So it is reasonable to maybe say this wasn't a good move at all. And I think there's arguments for and against it. But I personally nowadays I would say it's kind of just wasting moves, and instead a move like castling or rook to d8 would make a lot more sense here, or even rook c8, castles and then the rook on f to d8 would make a lot more sense. But okay, knight to h5, now we see knight to c3, and I took on g3, and then I played knight to f6. Okay, so I'm okay here. I'm happy I got the bishop pair, but it's a little scary still. After rook to c1, I still haven't castled yet, and well, my queen is kind of staring at this rook, and it's not happy where it is. I ended up playing rook to d8, getting a tempo, and then castling. But even still, it feels a little sketchy here. Objectively, I think the queen wants to be on b8, and this would be better placed, just because then you don't have to worry about any knight to d5s with discoveries of any sort. But okay, bishop to b3, and I ended up playing queen to b6, which doesn't really make too much sense. Queen to b6 technically blunders a pawn. I'm not going to say it just loses or anything. There is some compensation in the position, but it's very complicated compensation. Instead, the move queen to b8 is a lot more natural, where sure, it looks a little weird because you're moving your queen backward, and queen b6 is like this nice forward moving, it's an inching forward move. But that's not really what you want to do here because, well, when you lose the e5 pawn, you lose central control. You lose control over f4 and d4, which can become useful squares for white in the future, which is what you should think of when you lose a pawn. See, losing the h pawn or the a pawn, which is the pawns on the sides of the board, it might not matter as much. But when you lose a central pawn, you can notice it immediately. You can notice the effects immediately. Whereas losing the a or h pawn may only be prevalent in the endgame, where you can use that pawn as a distraction or deflection for your opponent to have to deal with. But alright, knight takes e5 was definitely played, as this is, a great move. You just take a pawn. And I played bishop to d6. Clearly after bishop to d6, it doesn't feel like I'm actually going for anything here. Maybe there was some bishop c5 ideas, but there's always knight takes f7 at the very least. Knight to d3 looks logical, but rook takes d3 and bishop takes f2 kind of makes that look undesirable, but what can you do about that, right? But okay, after knight takes e5, hey kitty. Okay, after knight takes e5, bishop to d6, now I'm just down a pawn, and this does not look good. After bishop to d6, knight takes f7, which is one of the better lines. Preferably, I'd say knight to g4 is a little bit stronger, and the reason why is because when you play knight takes f7, you're creating an imbalance. And when you create an imbalance in these types of positions, it's okay to do. It's absolutely okay to do. However, there is one thing I'd say about it that might not be so great, is you are complicating the position when you create an imbalance. When you create an imbalance, you're allowing your opponent to create dynamic play. And unfortunately, after rook takes, bishop takes, and king takes, now we can see here, they're up a pawn, but it's a lot more complicated than that. They essentially have 2 pawns and a rook versus my 2 minor pieces, if we can think of it like that instead. Whereas a rook and pawn and 2 minor pieces are an even exchange, I'm still down 1 point in material, but there's still a very interesting imbalance where I have 2 minor pieces versus their rook, and they just have 2 pawns for it. And in some cases, the 2 minor pieces can be better than the rook, and we will actually see something like that in this game. Queen to e3. This was definitely not the right call. It looks like e5 is winning material. However, we do have the lucky move rook to e8, which prevents any rook to e5 stuff. And after, say, even, well, f4 is not possible actually, but e6, we can just move back at the very least. As well, if we take it, then we just lose material because queen takes e6. And everything's fine here, so it's all good and well. But okay, king takes f7 and queen e3. And the problem is I can realistically trade, and they got rid of some of their advantage here, as sure, they're still up a rook for 2 pawns, but this actually should favor black in the sense that it's not so easy to play for white because, well, the 2 bishops for the rook, you can argue, is worth a pawn. So it might even be an equal or slightly better position for black. But okay, bishop to c5 is what I opted for instead. I was down material slightly, and I knew this, so I thought keeping pieces on the board would make more sense. And I think this is a reasonable call. This is the better move of the 2, and it's a good move, I'd say, just because there's always ideas of attacking f2. Now we see queen to e2, and there is the move knight to g4 in the position. However, I did not play this because this is a very weird move because you're allowing queen takes and bishop takes. And, well, if the king moves over, then you can always play a move like rook d6 and rook h6. And this should be much, much better for black. However, after knight g4 takes, bishop takes, king to f1 takes, takes. The thing is, after a move like rook f8 and then you just move back king g8, this is actually pretty good for black, as well. You can't go backwards with the king. You can't go back to g1. You can't go to your safety, and if you can't go to your safety, king e2 is one of the only moves, and well, we're down a pawn, but we have a huge initiative against our opponent, and plus their double pawns, you can say, is their extra pawn. And it doesn't look like a strong pawn at all. So arguably, black is better here. Queen to e2. I played rook to e8. I was just going for the e-pawn, as f3 is not possible. It's reasonable. It makes sense. Bishop takes e4 and knight takes e4 are both threats. But okay, knight a4. What a move. Things only get crazier from here. You think this is crazy so far? Knight a4, very, very strong move from my opponent. This is objectively the best reply. I looked at everything I could, and this is, well, this is an amazing move. Essentially what this does is, well, if I take immediately, my opponent has no more problems anymore. Queen to c4 check, and they take on c5, and let's just say king f8 or something like this. Not too specific, but these pawns are actually quite weak. It's hard to defend them both, and even if move like this is possible, this should actually still be better for white somehow. Just, rook c7, and there's a lot of activity with even moves like f3 coming. So it looks like it's still better for black in some ways, but it's in reality not, and it's very interesting to me. But that's the case. So instead, knight to a4. But okay, if you take on a4, sure, queen c4 and taking on c5, and everything is kind of dandy for them. However, bishop takes f2. So instead of going into that position, we take a pawn, and then it's not as big of a deal. So we're losing the bishop pair no matter what in this position, unfortunately, because, well, if we take it again, queen c4, and then you take the bishop pair, and the bishop pair is one of our best dynamic advantages, especially since both are kind of looking at the king. They're pretty strong pieces here. But after bishop takes f2, we're still losing the exchange, but in a different way, where after queen takes, and pawn takes, it's just slightly different, where the e4 pawn is now a weakness, and there's no moves like f3 to actually defend it. So this is just a slight advantage for black, but not by much. And now we see rook to c7, rook e7, and they take. And I think this was not the right call. I think they should have kept more pieces on the board, as this actually increases my advantage, I'd say. And the reason why I'd say this is because, well, now it's just one rook versus two pieces, two minor pieces. Whereas before it was two rooks, which can coordinate and threaten to take material. For example, if they get both rooks on the 7th rank, then they can attack these pawns. However, when they trade off one of the rooks, it's a lot harder to coordinate that rook to actually make any threats, which is very important. Even in defending, you need to create counter threats, but this is just not really a possibility here. We see e5. I ended up playing knight g4. Even if they could play king f3, I'd move back, but luckily, gotta remember that bishop, right? So these pieces actually coordinate quite well together, and the king is forced to go back in some way. King g1 was played. I think maybe even king e2 might have been better, even though it's hard to say. Knight takes e5 and bishop takes g2 were both possibilities. So it's difficult to actually evaluate that, but king g1 makes a lot of sense because, you don't want to just lose another pawn. But in reality, this pawn is lost because after king to e6, it's pretty much impossible to prevent knight takes e5. I played bishop to c6 as I'm more interested in getting my bishop to b5 and covering these two pawns, as you need the principle of two weaknesses or two strengths in this case, where I have the pawns on this side of the board and the pawns on this side of the board that I can use to my advantage. I can use one piece on one side and the other piece at the other. So this piece would protect these two pawns, and the important part about that, and well, these two, this knight can protect. But the important part about that is that because there's pawns on both sides of the board as well, and because there's still quite a few pawns on the board, they can't sacrifice the exchange to make a draw. And that's very important here. They played e6, and now I decided to play bishop to d5 just to go for the pawn. King f1, bishop to c4 check, just forcing them to go back to g1, and now I take on, I play knight f6 first, rook c1, and now I take on e6. It would be also reasonable to just take on e6 immediately as well. I think that would be perfectly fine, as it kind of just makes them waste a move. Knight to f6, rook c1, and bishop takes e6. Here we see rook c6, and unfortunately I am losing the a6 pawn. However, that is actually not too big of a worry, because bishop to b3, everything on this side of the board is covered, so everything's safe. I played bishop b3 immediately. I just wanted to get the piece protected, and well, if anything like rook to c7 check, I should have knight to d7, and if not, well, knight to d7 would just be good here, because, well, rook c6, now there might even be a knight b8 in the position, but even a5 could be challenging for them. But either way, I'm not too worried about keeping this pawn, and eventually I should activate my king. But alright. Rook takes on a6 after bishop b3. Knight to g4, just again trying to lock their king into the king side there, not giving them squares. We see rook a7, king f6, rook a6, king g5, rook a5, king g6, rook a6. I was originally just going to go knight f6, and I think that's fine as well, but I went king f5 and rook d6. My idea was to go king e4. Instead here I just go knight to e5, and I'm also preparing to go to e4 here. But the whole idea behind knight to e5 is I want to play g6 and h5 and everything is defended. But okay, rook d2, king to g4. I thought this would be an interesting move. King to f2, knight to c4. Now I'm threatening b2, and unfortunately they don't have a check, as if they play check here, king to g5, and this pawn is lost. And when this pawn is lost, this pawn is lost, as well, there's no real way to protect it. So there's no moves to get to a1 reasonably here. Takes, and then even if you get to a1, we can remaneuver to c2. So how should we do this? Something like this. Either way, I'm not gonna look at the exact route. I'm not sure exactly what the exact route would be. But essentially what we can do is just reroute to c2, where we attack the rook and the pawn at the same time. And this should be quite easy because c2 is also protected by the bishop. Okay. Again, just I got lost in thought there because I thought it would be interesting to look at. Rook e2, the only move. Unfortunately, bishop d1 does not work, as well. Rook e1 we can take here, so that's actually good for us. However, the problem is now we're not protecting our knight anymore, and we are actually pretty much losing this game. So we cannot allow that. And luckily I did not fall for that. I just played king f5 here, and now I'm looking at some possible knight or bishop to d1s. King e1, now bishop to d1 isn't possible. h5, trying to just increase my space as much as possible. Rook e7, g5, continuing this idea of creating space, and rook e2. And this idea of h5 and g5 are perfectly fine. However, I needed to find the right follow-up here, and I didn't. I played h4, which is not the right move at all. Instead, the move knight to d6 is a very surprising one. And the whole point is you are re-maneuvering to e4 and trying to win g3. And it's kind of an annoying thing to stop. So rook to e3, defending. Knight to e4, or even g4, for example, is very strong. And you're just going to play knight e4, and you can even maneuver to the other side of the board. Say, well, king e2, just making random moves. Now, knight to e4. They have to be very careful here, like, or I have to be very careful, so say something weird. You don't want to allow any king e4 stuff, but even then, it's pretty much impossible here. But let's just say they go back, and they just move forward, and eventually they get into a position like this. This is specifically, well, just stalemate, but even if they don't go for something like that, then we should have a reasonably winning position where now we can just win either b2 or just force them further into the corner, or even win the rook. But this kind of highlights how bad it can really be for white. Ooh. Rook to e2. h4. So this is not a good move because it trades off pawns. And right now, white has weaknesses. Why am I trading off this amazing pawn on h5? That's not weak at all. That can't be attacked, really. That's why it's not weak. For a pawn on g3, that can be weak. So this is not the right approach for me. And realistically, this is a very, very difficult game to win now. Luckily, after takes, king f1, I still kind of got something out of the position after king f4. Here we see king e1, and I ended up playing knight to e3, attacking g2. We see king to d2, and knight to d5. I just wanted to reroute as well. So then knight on d5 is just a little bit better. There's ideas of knight to f4 in the future, which can be useful, the f4 square here. King to d3, and king to g3. And now I am threatening knight f4 check, winning the pawn, and they're forced to move their king because I'm also threatening knight e3 check, winning the exchange. So king e4 here, and knight to f6 was played. This is not the right move. Surprisingly, this is actually working. Where after rook e3, king to g4, it's impossible to not lose this pawn. So that's very good. It's just, it looks like a scary move because, well, knight f4, come on. You know, their king is attacking it, your king's defending it. This just doesn't feel right. It turns out it's perfectly okay. And they can't really move away because, well, knight takes g2, and we just promote. But I played knight to f6, which is an okay move. It's just that it makes it harder to win because, well, knight f4 was just such a clear idea. King f5, knight to g4, and king to g5. And here I played knight to f2, and it might be tempting to take the exchange. And the reason why I say this is because, well, normally if you have the opposite color pawn and opposite color bishop to this, or sorry, if you have the opposite color bishop to the square, it would be losing, or sorry, it would be a draw. But the thing is, my king is just way too fast. King f2, oh, sorry, king g4, king f2, king f4. And as we can see, my king gets to the corner and theirs can't. And we win the pawn, and we win the game, as you can see now. This didn't happen. Instead, knight to f6, knight g4, knight f2, and rook e3. Now, after king to g2, it's also very difficult to win because, well, king to g2, unfortunately, everything is just liquidated now. It's not so clear anymore. As, well, sure, I have the minor pieces, and maybe there's still something I can play for, but realistically, it's very, very difficult, and there's likely not really much of a chance. However, this isn't the end of the game. We are about 2/3 of the way through, and we'll see why. King to f1, king to g3, knight to d1, attacking b2. Now we see rook to d3, and now we see that things aren't as great for white anymore, as, well, there are knight takes b2 possibilities, though this does look a little scary because of king f3. This actually should be okay after king to e1. Okay, sorry about that. I am back. My camera stopped recording because it hit the length limit of like 30 minutes or 40 minutes or something like that, because this is such a long game. But I swear, guys, we're getting to the end stuff, and it'll be a lot quicker from now on. Okay. King to e2. And as we can see, we're kind of just improving our king. We're going to be taking the pawns now. And luckily, we kind of got out of this. But it's kind of weird that we did. maybe we shouldn't have, and especially we pretty much shouldn't have after this position. As long as they keep their rook reasonably placed, it's kind of difficult to convert here as black. As long as, well, b2 can't be taken, then everything should be okay. But unfortunately, they let me win b2. And after knight takes b2, rook e4 check was tried. And after king d3, well, what would you play here as white? I'm just curious. What would you play? I think my opponent made the right choice because it's a position where international masters have messed up in. And it's rook takes a4. International masters messed up on this position? What? The whole point is I have a bishop and a knight. And this is notoriously one of the most rare and one of the most difficult endgames to convert. However, luckily for me, I had a coach at the time. You guys may know him, Eric Rosen. Phenomenal guy, phenomenal YouTuber. I'll put his link in the description. You should definitely check him out. I wanted to learn every checkmate. I learned the bishop and to the two bishops versus the king. I learned rook, the queen, etc. The only one I had struggles with was the bishop and knight. And although it seemed like a waste of time, and he said, well, this isn't the most necessary thing, which he was right about, I still wanted to learn it because I was more interested in learning about these things in chess rather than just improving itself. But obviously improving is something I was definitely interested in too. So he showed me how to do it properly. And well, he's a great teacher. Check him out. But let's see how the game progresses. King e6, king d4, king f5, bishop to c6, king to f4, knight to c4, king to f5, bishop to d5. The whole point is we're trying to box this king in and force it to the opposite square corner, as that is the most logical one to go to as well. If they go to this square, then it's easier to checkmate because that's the right square we need them in. But when we get them into this square here, in this area, then we can actually force a mate still. After king f6, king e4, king g5, king e5, we're just shouldering the king, forcing them to make a decision. Either they go this way or they go this way. That's really their only choice. Or they go back and we get to shoulder them further to the side of the board, which is where we need them to checkmate. King g6, knight to d6, and now I'm just bringing my knight around to play a move such as this. Knight to f5, which would further restrict their squares and force them to make even more choices. King g5, bishop to e6 now, and now they cannot go king to g4. King to g6 back, and it doesn't look like we're making much progress. However, our pieces are optimally placed here, as now our king is on the center, one of the center squares, and they are kind of boxed in here as well. Again, if they go backwards, then we can further enforce them, and this would be difficult for them. But after knight to f7, now g5 isn't playable. And now you can see the idea here. Now g5 isn't playable, king h5, well, there still is king to f5, and we do get them in that box that we wanted. So now we see king to g7, and king to f5. King to g8, and king to f6, and now all of a sudden they're on the side of the board. This is very important because since they're on the side of the board, we can force a checkmate on h1 here. And the way we do this is by letting them play king h7, then bishop f5 check, and they're forced to go back to g8. King to g8, bishop g6, we need to waste a move. King f8 is their only move, and the reason why we waste the move is because we want to play bishop h7. The idea here is we want to force them to go to this side of the board, and when they get to the side of the board, that's when checkmate can be delivered. King to f8, and now bishop h7. Their only move now is king e8. King e8, knight e5, and king f8. Knight d7. So the other thing we should look at here is also what if this is played. And the thing is, this is actually still checkmating after king to e6. Now, it might not look like it, but after king e8, well, there's knight d7, and we have the same pattern as before, and we will get to that. But after king to d8, king e6, Looks like they're getting out with king c7, but it's actually not quite the case because, well, they're in the wrong corner. It would be different if they were still on, say, f7 or something like this, but it's actually much different here. And the reason why is because, well, there's a key move here, and that is the move knight to d7. And the whole point is after king to c6, again, it looks like they're getting out. It really does. But there's this really beautiful move, bishop to d3, which coordinates everything perfectly. And all of a sudden, king to b5 is impossible. King to d5 is impossible. King to c5, king b6. The only two moves are to go to c7 or to b7. And then we see further restrictions, no matter what they do. Now bishop to d5, bishop to e4, sorry. And after king to c8, which is their only move, to be clear. Well, one of the two moves that they can play. These two moves are the only moves. But then we get this mating net again. But okay, going back to the actual game, instead what happened was knight to d7, king e8, king e6, king d8, king d6, king c8, and then knight to c5. And the whole point is recover b7, we keep them on the back rank, and after king to d8, we play bishop to g6 so they can't run to the other side of the board and make a draw. Because, again, there's 50 moves we have to do this, otherwise they can claim a draw. King c8, and now bishop to f7. After king to d8, we see knight to b7 check, and this was the idea. Again, now there's no king e8, and we saw this exact same pattern with bishop to g6 and then bishop to h7. So after knight b7, king c8, and king to c6, there's no longer king d8. So the knight will control the dark square and the bishop will control the light square, and it will progressively restrict the king to this corner. And we're seeing this in full action here. King b8, king to b6, king to c8, and bishop to e6 check. And now the king only has two squares, and now all we have to do is bring this knight to either c6 or a6 and bring the bishop to b7, and this is checkmate. And here what I decided to do is knight c5. Again, c8 is covered, so all white can do is shuffle back and forth. King a8, bishop to c8, and I hope you can see the mate now. King b8, bishop to a6, king a8, bishop b7 check, king b8, and knight to a6 with checkmate. Very interesting finish. There were a few people watching the game after because I'm pretty sure a lot of people didn't believe I'd be able to do it, and reasonably so. I was like a 1300, and 1300s likely, for the most part, will never know this. So my opponent made the right call, but I was very lucky in the fact that it was something I just studied. I probably need to study again, but chances are I'll never see it in my career ever again. And it's so rare, but it's a really nice thing to get, especially over the board. When I even told Eric about it after this, and he thought I was joking, and then I showed him the game, and it's just it's a very funny moment to look back on. But anyways, as we can see in game 3, I ended up winning. Very, very cool game to win. And now I'm 2 out of 3 in the tournament. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. I swear this is the longest game in my whole collection of games up to this point, for up to now. So there's like 40 more games to go that I'm still covering that I haven't played, because I might plan to play more games. But this is actually it for like the long, super duper long games. I swear this is the longest one. Anyways, thank you guys for watching and bearing with me on this, but I appreciate that, and I will see you in the next game.